All the preseason college football publications have hit the newsstand, so check out your favorite team. Most of you being Ohio State fans, got to feel pretty good about the team's chances, according to the so-called experts. But this is certainly the prime of talking season. Not a whole lot regards spring practice, other things going on. So talking season at its peak with all the preseason prognostications out there. I actually just got sucked into a Facebook debate where people were, of course, guaranteeing that this is going to happen or that's going to happen. Notre Dame's going to beat Ohio State, or guaranteeing that Ohio State's going to go undefeated and all of that. So consider your source and understand that I doubt if many of these guarantees could be, many of these people would put their mortgage or their life on the line based on these guarantees. We got Pat Murphy on the line, 247 Sports. Bucknuts, join him there and all of his work. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good, and I will be guaranteeing nothing today. So I don't feel like that's necessary at this point in the calendar.
I always thought that was amusing. Like an NFL player every so often will say, I guarantee we're going to win this game. And I would be fine if I was a head coach. I would say, okay, that means your game check is guaranteed, meaning if we lose this game, you're going to give us back your game check because you have guaranteed a victory. So if that's a guarantee, it's a guarantee. So a lot of guarantees out there. And again, some of them will be right and some of them will be wrong. And, consider your source. You may want to track them, including me. I'll make predictions, but no guarantees out of me either. But we know it's a talented football team. We know that, and everybody knows that.
Yeah, the Buckeyes certainly will have plenty of talent this year. I mean, this may be as just pure talent-wise, especially on the offensive side of the ball, as talented of a team as we've seen. And then the defense, we believe in the talent, and the talk has been, as we've talked about, Mark, okay, can the coaching take that talent to where it needs to be now that Ryan Day's gone out and hired pretty much an entirely new defensive staff? So I think when you look at some of these preseason publications, you look at, the fans talk and those guarantees, it's all based on that. The offense should be as good as it was last year, which was the best in the country. Maybe not, I don't know how the rankings will play out, and it obviously depends how other teams perform offensively, but I expect the Buckeyes to be right up there in the top 5 once again. That's what Ryan Day specializes in, and they certainly have the talent and the weapons to do that. And then the defensive side of the ball, I think, has taken or should take a big jump under Jim Knowles, and the fact that a lot of these guys are starting or contributing at a high level for the second time, as opposed to last year where many of these guys were first-time starters, first-time contributors for the Buckeyes. So those two things together, I think, are where you see kind of the confidence come about Ohio State and why the projections of what the Buckeyes could do this year are pretty high and pretty special.
Expectations can work in terms of motivation in a number of ways. Yeah. They can either bolster a team to say, we've seen it before out of our team on occasion. We know how these guys aren't dumb. They know when they can step on a field, they can measure their ability against other teams and other players on the field, and they know the rankings and they know the recruiting rankings and they know all of that. They know how good they are potentially. So that could bolster a team if they're going to put their noses down and then say, okay, that's all well and good. We know that. Okay, let's compartmentalize that because that's not going to get it done. Now we go to work and we make it happen. So it could be a source of confidence, but it also can work against you in terms of, we're that good and we don't need to work as hard, or there's just not that natural drive thinking, hey, we can get past just about everybody else, just kind of mailing it in. There are various motivations, incentives. We're all human, have a blood flowing through our veins, so it's difficult to predict how that affects each individual.
Certainly, and that's something Ryan Day is constantly aware of with his team, with himself, with his staff. He's said it multiple times, and he said it again recently on a local radio appearance here last week. When you're at Ohio State, you're not allowed to lose games. I mean, the Buckeyes every year are expected to go undefeated given what they've done in recent years. And he recognizes and embraces, frankly, that expectation. But that also means you have to handle things, as you were kind of alluding to there, Mark. And, he was recently on that radio appearance I mentioned, was asked about ESPN's SP Plus metric that had the Buckeyes as the #1 offensive team in the country by quite a bit. I think their distance over Alabama in terms of the numbers was the same from Alabama. I think it was Alabama and Georgia were tied. Alabama to Miami, who I think was 21. So in Ryan Day's perspective, sure, he knows how good his offense is. That's what he built. But he also knows week 1, Ohio State has to go out and play a Notre Dame team that isn't going to be a Youngstown State, a Miami of Ohio, one of those games that's essentially a warm-up for the Buckeyes. And if you lose that game, it doesn't matter what the metrics said in the offseason. Now you're behind the 8 ball based on where your expectations were, not only externally, but for themselves. Let's be honest. Ohio State was disappointed a year ago to not be in the Big Ten championship game and to not be in the college football playoff. That's where they expect to be. That's where they expect to be this year. So, yeah, it's good to have expectations, but you have to live up to those expectations. And, Ryan Day, especially publicly, but he's even said it privately, has to manage those the right way. And, so he doesn't want to hear about analytics saying that this could be the best offense in this amount of time or anything like that. He wants his team focused on getting better every day and eventually preparing specifically for that first week against Notre Dame.
Rewind 1 year, and you've got the Oregon game in week 2. That was a 14 or 15-point spread, which I thought was crazy. And I said, give me Oregon in the points, but I didn't expect Ohio State was going to lose that game. And then even throughout the course of the rest of the season, and Oregon was a good team. They went to the Pac-12 championship game. Taking Ohio State fans aside, even your average college football fan didn't even compare those teams the rest of the year. Said Ohio State, if they played again, they'd win. Now, that doesn't mean anything. They did play. Oregon won. But with all that confidence in Ohio State, they still went out on a given day at home and got run up and down the field and lost a game.
Yeah, and that's what the Buckeyes have to avoid this year. You have to play the game, and you saw that in that game, and you saw it in other games too. I mean, even week 1, Ohio State had struggles on the road against a Minnesota team that ended up not being very good. Now, Minnesota loses its running back in that game, and maybe things are different both for Minnesota in that game and for the season if that doesn't happen. But you saw some struggles there. I mean, you saw it in Oregon or against Oregon, and obviously the Michigan game at the end of the season, and even in the Rose Bowl. I mean, it wasn't a perfect game despite kind of how that game will be remembered for the epic comeback and the offense and whatnot. So I believe that the Buckeyes have learned from those mistakes. But again, it takes that supreme focus, especially when you have these early season big games. And, the teams that have done it the best, the Alabamas, Clemson, when they've been rolling, teams like that, it's all about taking it that one game at a time and not buying into the hype, in addition to talent and coaching and all that other stuff. But you have to have the mental side of it too. And that's what Ryan Day has really preached recently is, while there are expectations, managing those expectations and mentally being ready to go when the games kick off.
Pat Murphy, Bucknuts 247 Sports, join his work right there. Pat joins us on a regular basis to break down the Buckeyes. So when we translate that, all that talent, ability, and everything, but match it up against the opponents, everyone looks at the bookend of the schedule, which is, of course, a huge matchup against Notre Dame to start things off. And then you got the game against the defending Big Ten champions at the end in Michigan. Those would seem to be the obvious choices. So I'll start us off here, Pat. The concern with Notre Dame is that they're really talented and good as well. But internally, the first thing that jumps out at me about the Notre Dame game is Jim Knowles. I trust him, trust his ability, but it's the first time on the field. There's not a warm-up, there's not 2 warm-ups, and there are no preseason games, and it's a talented bunch of guys with a really good defensive coordinator, but this is the first time it all has to come together against a quality opponent.
Exactly. I mean, the only time that Ohio State has been able to run their defense out has been against Ohio State. And, while that's a good offense to measure yourself against, it's not a real live game situation. Jim Knowles, even in the spring game when they're calling things as live as they possibly can, it's still different. And there's still not the pressure and things like that. You're not facing an opponent that you're completely unfamiliar with, week 1. And so it'll certainly be interesting to see that. I think on the Notre Dame side too, you've got a new coaching staff there as well. So that puts some pressure on Notre Dame, but it leaves something to, sort of some unpredictability for what the Fighting Irish will do. You got a little bit of a sense of it in their bowl game, which ironically was against Oklahoma State, where Jim Knowles came from, but he was not a part of that game. So I think that game has a lot of intrigue, even more than your average, week one marquee game, just because you do have a lot of newness in there. Everyone will be interested to see what Ohio State's defense looks like and if it lives up to kind of the hype that's built this offseason of that turnaround that the Buckeyes expect. And then obviously Notre Dame as well, and what they look like under Marcus Freeman the first time he's been a head coach. So a lot of compelling stuff to come out of that game. And yeah, it certainly won't be easy. You mentioned kind of the bookend schedule of that. The Michigan game always matters, but it matters a lot more if Ohio State goes in that game undefeated, and that means getting that win week one to kind of roll through the schedule.
So, Pat, when you take a look at the schedule, and Ohio State fans don't need to be reminded that it's not always the marquee matchups that trip up an Ohio State team, 2017, 2018, Iowa, Purdue, of course. Those teams still won the Big Ten championship, but they got tripped up unexpectedly by decent teams. So when you look at the 22 schedule, certainly a couple Western Division games jump out at me, but what do you see?
Well, first of all, in terms of those games that have tripped the Buckeyes up in the past, I think Ryan Day's done a really good job of avoiding that. His 4 losses have come 2 in the college football playoff, and then obviously the 2 last year, but to 2 good teams. So not to say that won't ever happen. Obviously, Urban Meyer was a really good coach as well, but I think they've done a good job of avoiding that strange trip-up game. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. You mentioned some of the Western Division games. Wisconsin early in the year, the first Big Ten game. But I look down the schedule. I see you go at Michigan State, Iowa at home, and at Penn State and at Northwestern. Now, there is a bye week between Michigan State and Iowa, but that's going to be an interesting stretch for the Buckeyes because Michigan State is a team on the rise. You have to go there after a beatdown that the Buckeyes put on them last year. The Spartans will certainly want to get some revenge there. Iowa is not expected to be any sort of pushover this year in the Big Ten. Now, that game is in Columbus. The game at State College is not going to be the annual whiteout game, which could mean it's not even a night game, given kind of how the schedule looks. We haven't gotten a kick time for that, so maybe you catch a bit of a break there. But then at Northwestern, kind of after that stretch, if Northwestern is, every few years they have that team that makes a run. If that's one of these Northwestern teams, I mean, that game becomes increasingly difficult given you've gone 3 out of 4 weeks, given the off week, against some pretty tough competition. So that's the stretch that I really look at in the season to kind of determine what this Buckeye team is going to be. I think 1 loss is probably something Ohio State could manage, but with, as we talked about expectations earlier, and you mentioned people guaranteeing this team's going to go undefeated, that's what Ohio State is expected to do. And navigating that stretch of 4 games in 5 weeks, I think will be crucial for reaching that goal of an undefeated regular season and potentially making it back to the Big Ten championship game.
Yeah, for those people that like to strategize, if there's going to be a loss, what is the quote unquote best loss to have? I think it's pretty obvious that it's Notre Dame. If you're just thinking technically from the standpoint of win all the games in the conference, win the Big Ten, lock that up, and obviously then it becomes more distant because it's the first game. And if Notre Dame goes on to another 11-1 type season, then it's not that huge of a deal unless it's 35-7. But as it goes through the schedule, if we get past that one, I got to think one of those Western Division games, again, it's not going to look good to lose to a Wisconsin or Iowa, but it's not a head-to-head against somebody you may need a win against at the top of the Eastern Division if there's going to be a loss.
Right. And you've seen in the past, you go back to when Ohio State won the national championship in 2014, that early loss to Virginia Tech. That wasn't even a good Virginia Tech team, ultimately, a team that dropped out of the top 25. But, if you're able to get better throughout the year, win the Big Ten, even if Notre Dame doesn't have a great season under Marcus Freeman in his first year, I think that loss, as you said, it's in the distance. If Ohio State looks the part the rest of the year, there should be opportunities to beat other ranked teams, Wisconsin, Penn State, Iowa, Michigan State, Michigan, all possible top 25 teams. So you'll certainly have the opportunity. I just think when you have a team like Ohio State coming into the year with the expectations, but still with some question marks, a good performance in that opening week or that whenever that opening kind of marquee game is can really set the tone. And that doesn't mean the Buckeyes don't lose another game along the way, but then you kind of have that ace card in your back pocket. You know, we beat a Notre Dame team that likely will come into the horseshoe as a top 10 team. And, you know, you have that card to play throughout the rest of the season. And then if you do trip up, say, at Michigan State, maybe that's not a terrible loss. You have the win against Notre Dame. You beat Wisconsin, you beat Iowa, you beat Penn State, you beat Michigan. Okay, then you still probably have a pretty good resume come the end of the year. Now, obviously, the goal, as I said, win the games. You don't have to worry about any of that. But yeah, I think you're right. That early game can be the one that if you lose can be pushed off, but it can also kind of set you off on a run for the rest of the season.
Pat, I don't know what kind of feedback you hear from Buckeyes fans in regards to their expectations for this game, but my goodness, there's always a 45 or 52 next to Ohio State in terms of the live chats that we have here. And then there's always a 21 or 24 next to it. Like most Ohio State fans, if my channel's any barometer, expect Ohio State to win this game by anywhere from 2 to 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, that's what I've seen. And honestly, without really looking into Notre Dame, you know, I paid attention to what they did during spring practice, you know, as much as I could while also covering Ohio State. You know, I think that's an offense that's going to have trouble keeping up with Ohio State. And I think, at least on paper, and that's where I think most people are kind of looking at that. You know, you expect Ohio State's defense, even if it is the first game, to be better than it was last year. So therefore, Notre Dame, if Ohio State can get a few stops, Notre Dame has to figure out a way to keep up. Can they stop Ohio State's offense? Well, if Ohio State's offense is as good as it was last year, probably not very frequently. So I think that's kind of the perception there. Now, you know, again, we don't know a ton about what this Notre Dame team is going to look like. Yes, the spring game didn't look great offensively, but they have a whole offseason to work on things. Marcus Freeman, obviously a defensive first coach. He's familiar with Ohio State, not just because he played here, but was coaching at Cincinnati for quite a while. I'm sure he's kept up with what the Buckeyes have done. And now he adds a guy like James Laurinaitis, who was analyzing the Buckeyes locally and for the Big Ten Network to his staff the last several years. So that helps. Yeah, I mean, I understand where those predictions are coming from. And, you know, I think that's probably what you'll see a lot of people predict as we get closer, even kind of the experts, just because of what I said. How it plays out, we'll certainly see. I think oftentimes those week one games tend to be lower scoring, maybe a shorter margin. I mean, you've even seen some of the Alabama neutral site games some years be a little bit closer than you expected, or maybe Alabama pulls away late, even when they're not playing a top team. So, you know, it's always tough week one to predict what it's going to look like, especially on, you know, a spread type of situation.
The new Notre Dame quarterback, Tyler Buckner, did not participate in the spring game. He had kind of a fluke injury, but he should be fine. You're looking at a new quarterback, but at the same time, almost in a J.J. McCarthy, Michigan fashion, played in a lot of various packages and meaningful games. So he's not completely like a C.J. Stroud entering 2021 where he didn't see the field. He played quite a bit, but wasn't the starter. But so he's not necessarily going to get wowed by the situation. He's played in a Fiesta Bowl and a lot of marquee games in spurts. So that'll be something to keep an eye on as well.
Well, and
Pat, anything else?
Yeah, just one thing. I think fans were a little worried this game was going to end up being a big noon kickoff. And they've announced since last time we talked that it'll be a night game. And I think that does help Ohio State from the perspective of getting the actual home field advantage. You know, I'm sure people listening to this have seen Ohio State at some of those noon games. The Oregon game was solid crowd. I mean, a good crowd, but it took a while for the fans to really get into it. I think when you have all day to prepare and whatnot, that certainly helps. And I certainly think despite maybe some recent marquee games going the way of the visiting team at Ohio Stadium in terms of those non-conference matchups, I still think having that crowd behind this Buckeye team week one at night will sway things a little bit Ohio State's way.
And again, looking at the entirety of the schedule, Michigan, of course, won the game last year, but the three most recent wins for Michigan in the series span, of course, 18 years, and they all came in the Big House. They haven't won in Columbus since 2000. I just posted a video the other day, kind of like a series, is this the year? blank, fill in the blank. First edition was Michigan wins in Columbus for the first time since 2000. And if you check out both of these programs' metrics against top 10 to 15 opponents, they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, despite what happened at the Big House last year, especially Michigan on the road. 0-18 against top 15 opponents since 2006.
Wow. I would not have guessed that.
Yes, 8 of those under Harbaugh.
Yeah.
All right, Pat. Well, appreciate you stopping by. As always, everybody check out Pat's work on Bucknuts 247 Sports.
Thanks for having me, Mark.